The prelude to Pearl Harbor, a day of infamy. Dawn breaks over Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The gentle Hawaiian breeze carries nothing but the familiar sounds of a military base slowly waking up. In just 2 hours, this tranquil morning would transform into what President Franklin D. Roosevelt would call a date which will live in infamy. But the real story of Pearl Harbor began long before the first Japanese plane appeared in the sky that Sunday morning. Picture yourself in Tokyo, 1940. In a dimly lit room of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits at his desk, poring over intelligence reports. The brilliant naval strategist who would later mastermind the Pearl Harbor attack is troubled. He knows that a war with America could be catastrophic for Japan, yet he's being pushed to plan exactly that. "If I am told to fight," he would later write, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." What drove Japan, a nation that had previously sought to modernize itself following American models, to risk everything on such a bold and dangerous gambit? The answer lies in a complex web of economic pressure, military ambition, and cultural misunderstanding that had been building for decades. The story truly begins in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry's Black Ships forced Japan to end its 2-century-long isolation. This traumatic opening to the West left an indelible mark on the Japanese psyche. Never again would Japan allow itself to be technologically or militarily inferior to Western powers. Within a few decades, Japan had transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial and military power. But modernization came with a price. Japan, an island nation poor in natural resources, became increasingly dependent on imports, particularly oil, steel, and rubber. By the 1930s, this dependency had become a strategic vulnerability. The Japanese Empire looked to expand its influence in Asia, seeing it as both a manifest destiny and a practical necessity to secure vital resources. This expansion put Japan on a collision course with American interests in the Pacific. The United States had its own vision for Asia, centered on an open-door policy that would guarantee American access to Chinese markets. As Japan moved to establish its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, essentially a Japanese-dominated economic bloc, tensions with America escalated. Few Americans today realize that the road to Pearl Harbor was paved with economic sanctions. In 1940, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States imposed increasingly restrictive measures. The most devastating came in July 1941, a complete oil embargo. For a nation that imported 80% of its oil from America, this was nothing short of economic strangulation. The Japanese leadership faced an impossible choice. They could withdraw from their conquests in China and Southeast Asia, effectively surrendering their aspirations for regional dominance and economic security. Or they could seize the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies, which would inevitably mean war with America. The military leaders who dominated the government saw retreat as unthinkable. But how could Japan hope to win a war against an industrial giant like the United States? This is where Yamamoto's strategic genius came into play. He knew Japan couldn't win a long war, but perhaps it didn't have to. If Japan could deliver a crushing blow to America's Pacific Fleet and quickly seize the resources it needed, perhaps the United States would choose negotiation over a costly Pacific war. The plan that emerged was audacious. Japanese carriers would approach Hawaii in complete secrecy, launch a massive air attack to destroy the Pacific Fleet, and deal such a devastating blow that America's ability to interfere in Asia would be crippled for months, if not years. The operation required absolute surprise, a requirement that would later fuel American accusations of treachery. What's often overlooked is how close the plan came to being canceled. Throughout the fall of 1941, while Japanese diplomats conducted increasingly futile negotiations in Washington, Yamamoto and his staff worked feverishly to perfect their strategy. They studied British air attacks on the Italian fleet at Taranto, developed shallow-water torpedo modifications, and meticulously planned every detail of the approach to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese preparations for Pearl Harbor represent one of the most remarkable feats of military planning in history. Every possible variable had to be accounted for, every potential obstacle anticipated. The slightest error could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Consider the challenge of navigation alone. 6 aircraft carriers, along with their escort ships, would need to sail over 4,000 miles across the stormy North Pacific without being detected. They would maintain total radio silence, traveling through one of the least frequented parts of the ocean. The ships would refuel at sea, a dangerous operation in the best conditions, let alone in the rough winter waters of the North Pacific. In the fall of 1941, Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii under diplomatic cover. His mission was to observe and report on the movements of the American fleet. Every Sunday morning, he would drive to the heights above Pearl Harbor and watch as the American sailors followed their predictable routines. He noted how the ships were moored, the usual patrol patterns, and, crucially, the lack of torpedo nets protecting the battleships. Meanwhile, in Japan, pilots trained relentlessly for an attack they didn't yet know they would conduct. To maintain secrecy, they practiced dropping torpedoes and bombs on a training range deliberately constructed to resemble Pearl Harbor. The pilots weren't told their actual target until the fleet was already at sea. What many Americans don't realize is that the Japanese Navy had developed special weapons specifically for Pearl Harbor. Standard aerial torpedoes would have been useless in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. They would have simply stuck in the harbor bottom. Japanese engineers modified their torpedoes with special wooden fins that would keep them from diving too deep. They also developed armor-piercing bombs by adapting battleship shells, capable of penetrating the thick deck armor of American battleships. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. As the ship sailed east, they received a now famous message: "Climb Mount Nitaka." This coded phrase meant that negotiations had failed and the attack would proceed as planned. The journey across the Pacific was harrowing. Huge waves crashed over the decks of the carriers. The ships maintained strict blackout conditions at night, navigating through storms without lights. The crew's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. A single American patrol plane spotting them would doom the entire operation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Pearl Harbor attack was its psychological dimension. The Japanese planners had carefully studied American psychology and military thinking. They knew that Sunday morning was when security would be most relaxed. They understood that Americans would never expect an attack so far from Japan. Most importantly, they realized that the American military's faith in the safety provided by the Pacific Ocean had created a dangerous complacency. This complacency extended to the highest levels of American command. Despite increasing warnings of possible Japanese aggression, despite the breaking of Japanese diplomatic codes, despite reports of suspicious Japanese fleet movements, the American military remained largely unprepared for an attack on Pearl Harbor. The prevailing wisdom held that Japan would strike south toward the resource-rich territories it coveted, not east across the vast Pacific. Even when the attack was imminent, chances to detect it were missed. Early on the morning of December 7th, the destroyer USS Ward depth-charged and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. This clear act of war somehow failed to trigger a general alert. Less than an hour later, radar operators on Oahu detected the incoming Japanese aircraft, but were told not to worry about it. The radar return was assumed to be a flight of American B-17 bombers due in from California. The Japanese strike force reached its launch position 230 miles north of Oahu at 6 a.m. on December 7th. The seas were rough, with heavy swells making aircraft launching difficult. Despite the conditions, 183 aircraft of the first attack wave were airborne within 15 minutes, a testament to the Japanese carrier's well-drilled crews. As the first wave of aircraft approached Oahu, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the attack leader, anxiously scanned the harbor below. Would the Pacific Fleet be there? Had they somehow been warned? Then, through a break in the clouds, he saw them, 8 American battleships neatly moored along Battleship Row. At 7:53 a.m., Fuchida sent the famous signal, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" indicating complete surprise had been achieved. The first Japanese bombs fell on Wheeler Field at 7:55 a.m., targeting the American fighters on the ground. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers swept in low over Pearl Harbor, launching their weapons at the battleships moored along Ford Island. The Americans were caught completely off guard. Anti-aircraft guns were unmanned, ammunition lockers were locked, and many sailors were still asleep in their bunks. The scene that unfolded over the next 2 hours would forever change both nations. Japanese dive bombers screamed down from high altitude, their distinctive whine becoming a terrifying herald of destruction. Torpedo bombers skimmed just above the harbor waters, releasing their deadly cargo into the sides of American battleships. The morning air filled with black smoke, the thunder of explosions, and the desperate sound of air raid sirens. In the chaos, individual acts of American heroism emerged. Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant on the USS West Virginia, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no formal training, shooting at Japanese aircraft until he ran out of ammunition. Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill of the USS Nevada braved strafing fire to cast off the battleship's lines, allowing it to get underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. These and countless other acts of bravery would later be recognized, though many of the heroes never lived to receive their medals. The Japanese attack achieved tactical brilliance through its carefully planned sequence. The first wave targeted airfields and battleships, while the second wave, arriving 45 minutes later, focused on other ships and facilities. By attacking the airfields first, they prevented American fighters from effectively responding. By concentrating on battleships, they struck at what both navies then considered the core of naval power. But in the midst of their tactical success, the Japanese made 3 crucial strategic errors. First, they failed to destroy the Pearl Harbor fuel storage tanks, which contained 4.5 million barrels of oil crucial for Pacific operations. Second, they missed the American aircraft carriers, which were out at sea during the attack. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, they underestimated the psychological impact the attack would have on the American people. The cost in human lives was devastating. 2,403 Americans died that day, including 68 civilians. 18 ships were sunk or damaged, including all 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, with 129 attackers killed. But these numbers only tell part of the story. The attack's aftermath transformed America. The next day, President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech galvanized the nation. American isolationism vanished overnight, the country unified with a sense of purpose and resolve that would drive the war effort for the next 4 years. Japan had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, but in doing so, they had awakened what Admiral Yamamoto allegedly feared, a sleeping giant. For Japan, the attack was initially celebrated as a great victory. The newsreels showed triumphant pilots returning to their carriers, proud sailors celebrating their success. But Yamamoto's prediction proved prophetic. The initial advantage gained at Pearl Harbor was gradually erased as America's industrial might mobilized for war. The aircraft carriers that escaped the attack would prove decisive in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, where the tide of war in the Pacific began to turn. The legacy of Pearl Harbor extends far beyond the military outcome. It fundamentally altered the relationship between America and Japan, creating deep wounds that would take generations to heal. It changed how America viewed its role in the world, ending its isolation and ushering in an era of global engagement that continues to this day. The attack demonstrated the importance of intelligence and preparedness, leading to significant reforms in American military and intelligence services. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor stands as a solemn reminder of that Sunday morning in December 1941. Below its white arch, oil still seeps up from the sunken battleship. Locals call these drops the Black Tears of the Arizona. Each year, over 2 million visitors come to pay their respects, including many Japanese, who leave offerings of peace at the memorial. The attack on Pearl Harbor reminds us that history often turns on miscalculation and misunderstanding. The Japanese leadership believed they could force America to negotiate by delivering a crushing blow. Instead, they united a divided nation and sealed their own fate. It's a lesson that resonates even today, as nations continue to grapple with issues of power, perception, and the consequences of their actions on the world stage. The story of Pearl Harbor is not just about a surprise attack or the start of America's involvement in World War II. It's about how decisions made in distant capitals can change the course of history, how cultural misunderstandings can lead to catastrophic consequences, and how the human spirit can rise from devastating defeat to achieve ultimate victory. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. If you found this video informative, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating stories from Japanese history. Also, let us know in the comments what other aspects of Japanese history you'd like us to explore in future videos.